Well, thank you all for being here. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your morning, and I'm so excited to be part of this group, Experts for Entrepreneurs, and I'm very excited to share with you today, Health is Wealth. So let's get started here. I'll talk just briefly about the concept of health is wealth. We spend so much time working on our businesses and in our businesses that it's very easy to neglect ourselves or put ourselves second. What I'm going to share with you today is some very contemporary thinking, some updated information, very heavy in the nutrition end of things because this has been neglected for years and we've had some misinformation along the way. So we're going to get updates there, and all the while I'd like for you to just play the tape in the back of your mind that applying these things immediately in little increments is the way to bring about the change. And I'm here to help with those things, so please feel free to contact me at any time after this presentation today. You'll see my contact info on the cards in front of you and also on the slideshow. So without further ado, let's get started. Why we talk wellness. We're covering this subject today because it relates to health and wellness, and what we've been told by the experts regarding nutrition for years is inaccurate. Recently, we're seeing a windfall of information come down about nutrition and how some of the information that we've been given over the last few decades has been incorrect. So we'll cover some more detail on that and explain that. Why this wellness status has failed to produce desired results when we've implemented, even at the governmental level, some of the facts that were held out as true. Business owners are particularly susceptible to neglecting their own well-being in the interest of focusing on their businesses. So I'm excited about sharing this with you. And we as individuals have the power to affect the outcome of our health. This is a very simple statement, but this is really the takeaway that I want you to have from today's presentation. That when we look at disease states, we're going to talk a little bit about the four biggest threats to our health in the United States of America, as outlined by our Center for Disease Control. And what I want you to understand is there's a common thread that runs through this, and that we have control over so much of what affects our health. So let's without further ado, step into that realm. The reason you're here listening to me today is that my focus is entirely on holistic wellness, helping patients to bridge that gap between where their knowledge base is and what they understand in terms of health and wellness, and help to keep the concepts contemporary and move them along. Show them that it's much easier to implement some of these changes than is often thought. And by empowering individuals with scientifically valid and contemporary thinking, we see fantastic results. You'll understand a little bit more as I continue why I'm saying contemporary thinking, because we've had some antiquated stuff out there for a while. Why is now the time? Well, we have unprecedented knowledge in the human body. It's very rare that you'll hear a physician stand up in front of a room and tell you this, but I will tell you this right now. We understand a small percentage of what goes on in our bodies. Okay? This, in general, is a true statement. In fact, if the body were a 5-gallon bucket, for instance, we understand about a cup, 1 cup of that. The rest is still a mystery, although we've made huge leaps forward recently with things like the Human Genome Project, which was just completed in the early 2000s. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But when we look at the time and the place that we're in right now, there's a lot of new information coming out about health and wellness, and particularly, it's very timely for me to be discussing the nutrition component. There are movies being produced. There was Food Inc. not too long ago. More recently, we've got one called Fed Up that covers some of the details of the food industry and how our foods are affecting our health. And then, for instance, yesterday I was listening to National Public Radio, and they had a specialist on there talking about diabetes and the effect of diabetes on industrialized nations. In fact, there's a new term called diobesity. Now we've got a new term that actually melds obesity and diabetes together because these are related concepts. And so these are especially critical times for us to harness the power of some of this knowledge I'm going to present today and implement those changes. We work so hard in our businesses, and the success we achieve within our business is our chief goal within that business, but the quality that we have to enjoy that success is so crucial as it relates to our wellness practices. So we're going to try to keep it upbeat for a lot of this, but right now we're talking about the 4 biggest threats to our health. And we call these first world health threats. These are threats of excess or surplus. Our abundance that we're blessed to have here allows us to engage in consumption patterns that sometimes can be detrimental to us. But what I'm going to outline here is that while personal responsibility and personal action can go so far, we've not exactly had a fair presentation brought to us in terms of what we can do for our health. We're going to change some of that, and the change is in the air already. So, leading causes of death, this is directly from the Center for Disease Control website. It's a very interesting website, a lot of great information. And listed in this order, we've got heart disease as the biggest threat. Almost 600,000 people were affected with heart disease in 2010, died from heart disease, I should say. Cancer is second. Which kind of cancer is most? That lumps all cancers together. Yeah, all So it differs for men and women. Skin cancers are the most common. So something like basal cell carcinoma is something that's very common. It's also very treatable. The more severe skin cancers would be like melanoma, but that would be the most common, generally speaking. And then we have gender-specific. Prostate cancer and breast cancer are some of the bigger threats. Colon cancer is huge. Colon cancer is huge. And that's for both men and women also. Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Chronic lower respiratory diseases. When it's stated like that, it's a little bit hard to understand what they're speaking of, but this covers 2 categories. COPD, which is emphysema, or chronic bronchitis, okay? And so both of those are heavily affected by smoking. And then stroke, or cerebral vascular diseases. So stroke accounts for about 130,000 deaths in 2010. So I've got heart disease bolded there, and here's what I want to show you. This is just one journal article that I pulled up from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and the details of it are in the lower right-hand corner there, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. This is February 2006, but what I wanted you to see here is the highlighted area speaks that inflammation participates centrally in all stages of the disease process, and the disease process being spoken of as atherosclerotic activity. This is plaque formation within our arteries, okay? So what's being said here is that the traditional view of this atherosclerotic plaquing as a lipid storage disease, meaning the fats that we consume in our diet or the cholesterol that's within the foods that we eat, this is crumbling. This concept that is what's driving this disease process is no longer contemporary. We realize now that there's an inflammatory component, and inflammation participates centrally in all stages of the disease, from the initial lesion to the end stage, and that word thrombolytic complication means a blood clot, which is often what clogs an already narrowed artery and causes a cardiovascular incident. So what's being stated here is that we've been told all along about lipids, meaning different types of fats in our diet that we should eat, and then we've been told about cholesterol. Neither of those are the focus any longer. We recognize that, in fact, inflammation excuse me, is a bigger factor. Next, we'll talk about cancer. Much about what we know about cancer relates to what we call aberrant cell growth, which means we've got cell replication, which is supposed to happen in our bodies to renew and rejuvenate our bodies, replace old cells. When this happens out of control, it's referred to as aberrant cell growth. And what happens there is the coding, or the genes that help to code for the proteins that the cells build, the code becomes dysfunctional, and we actually have this aberrant cell growth or out of control cell growth. Well, with cancer, you're probably going to be surprised to find out that inflammation is a big component of it. Here's an article from Subcell Biochemistry is the journal, and I'll break down some of what's being said here. cyclooxygenase, or COX2, is what's listed up top. You might hear sometimes in pharmaceutical ads they'll talk about COX2 inhibitors. Vioxx and Celebrex are both examples. What happens is that cyclooxygenase, or COX2, when that's blocked, that reduces inflammation in the body. So that COX2 is actually an inflammatory entity. It helps to drive more inflammation in our bodies. Now, inflammation in the short run is a good thing. It's what causes tissue healing. If we have an injury, let's say I would cut my hand, the initial inflammatory response would cause that healing to begin. But we want that to shut off pretty quickly after it begins. And within a few days, we'd like for that to be downregulated and no longer have an active inflammation. When I speak of inflammation as it relates to heart disease and the cancer, I'm talking about a low-level systemic inflammation, and it's mediated largely by our diet. That's why it's so pertinent to what we're talking about today. So again, inflammation is a process that's natural. We couldn't live without it. It keeps us alive. But when it's not kept in check and it becomes a systemic or whole body issue, it makes us susceptible, we now know, to the heart disease and also cancer. So what's being said here is aberrant induction of COX2. That means out of control inflammation in the body and upregulation of prostaglandin cascade. Prostaglandin is another type of inflammatory entity. So it's saying we've got inflammation that's present and it's begetting more inflammation that's building in the body. Both of those are emphasized in the inflammogenesis model of cancer. So not only in cancers do we see increased inflammation, but that inflammation begets more dysfunction on a cellular level. Okay? So wow, the top two threats to our health we've just identified have a common link, and it's inflammation. Uncontrolled inflammation. So the third one, the chronic lower respiratory diseases, and again, smoking is a big culprit here. We've got a lot of folks who in their earlier generations, in their generation or an earlier time in their life, became addicted to cigarettes. It's difficult to kick, but I can tell you it's a profound difference when somebody can kick that habit. And even if they've been a lifetime smoker, they benefit from the first day that they stop smoking. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, as it relates to chronic lower respiratory diseases, probably the biggest single reason. And you're not going to be too surprised to find out that inflammation, chronic inflammation, is a player here. Now we know that in that case there's a driver, the cigarette smoke. It is possible for people to develop COPD from environmental exposure, okay? It's also possible to have the chronic bronchitis just from chemical or fume exposure. That can happen from solvents, paints, gasoline. But inflammation that's out of check is a factor. It's associated with a chronic inflammation of the airways and lung, parenchyma, that's a particular type of cells in there. And the inflammatory changes in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease are due to the release of these inflammatory mediators, these cytokines and chemokines, which actually beget more inflammation. So what's the issue here? Because we know in the case of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease that there's something outside the body that's irritating it. It's either the cigarette smoke, the solvent, the paint, whatever is the irritant. Is that the problem? Well, that's the initial cause, but that the body can't downregulate that or can't use the inflammatory cascade to reduce the effects of that is the real problem. And then our next factor is stroke. And I've probably already given it away. Inflammation is the common link here. This is from the journal Brain Pathology. Pretty straightforward journal. We know what they're working with, diseases of the brain. This is from January 2000, but it says ischemic stroke, which means when there's blood flow that's interrupted to an area of the brain, or central nervous system, brain or spinal cord. When that blood is deprived from that area, ischemia is the concept that the oxygen can't be delivered. It's the leading cause of death and disability in developed countries, yet in spite of substantial research efforts, no specific therapy for stroke is available. But the review of the article on inflammation in stroke summarizes key data supporting the possibility that inflammatory cells and mediators are important for contributing and confounding factors in this brain injury. Again, we have an event that sets off an inflammatory cascade, but then the body's inability to bring itself back into a comfortable, what we call homeostasis or balance, is the real issue. So let's talk a little bit about how this happened and where we can go. So the path we took to get here, we're going to cover how we got where we're at today. Okay? We're going to talk about what we've learned over the last 30 years, because it has been a long 30 years as it relates to these factors. And then we're going to talk about what to do to fix it. And again, remember my take-home message that small actions taken immediately can make profound differences. Yes, huge differences. So here we go. The common link is under our control. This is the take-home message. Inflammation is a common factor present in the foremost common causes of morbidity, and through dietary choices we can directly affect our inflammatory status. This second point is so important to understand. Our diet is the single biggest thing we can do to affect our inflammatory status beyond anything we can take pharmaceutically, beyond anything that can be done in terms of exercise, which is a very important component of regulating inflammation in the body also. It's huge. But our diet is the single biggest thing we have control over. We've had quantum growth in our knowledge in this area, and by that I mean this era of new thinking on wellness. We are in the driver's seat now. We have complete control, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this concept. We have complete control on mediating our inflammatory burden within our body. We now know that more than ever, and we learned a lot of this from the Human Genome Project. So let's talk about the Human Genome Project just for a moment. This started in 1990, and initially, at the onset, the National Institute for Health and our Department of Energy actually worked together on this project. When the Human Genome Project began, it was an arduous task. They allowed 15 years, and they said in the next 15 years, we're going to map the entire human genome, which basically means look at all the genes that are within our bodies that code for and create proteins, the structures our bodies are made of and run off of. Huge task. What they did was they finished ahead of time and under budget. I'm going to remind you this is our government. Ahead of time and under budget. So the profound thing that happened was that when they got in there, they realized that there weren't nearly as many genes present in the human body as they originally thought. And this is true for other mammals too, because they mapped out other animals along the way. Not just humans, they did fruit flies and mice, platypus. Interesting reasons for that. But back to the human genome, they originally thought we'd have around 150,000 genes. That was just a rough guess based on the complexity of our bodies and the variance that happens from person to person. What they ended up finding out is we came in just under 20,000. 20,000, and we thought we would be closer to 150. So let's talk a little bit about what that actually means. The project finished 2.5 years ahead of time and under budget, and the overarching take-home message is that you have direct control over the majority of the factors that influence your health, and let me explain why. It's very common, very, very common, when we begin understanding genetics, but prior to the Human Genome Project, to think that genes were a set entity, that we were born with this certain code, this genetic code, and it was outside our control what was going to happen to us. If we were coded for this particular disease state, it was going to manifest itself in our bodies. And we even thought that when we mapped this, the possibility existed, we thought, that when we mapped out the human genome, that we would even be able to judge chronologically that a given health issue might present itself at a certain age, once we understood these genes. So we get to the point where the Genome Project's completed, and we have many fewer genes than we thought originally. And then on top of it, 99.9% of genes that are shared between individuals are identical. So what makes us each unique individuals, which we are, very unique individuals, is less than 0.1%. So something's going on here. The genes not only are responsible for more than we originally thought they were, but they modify themselves based on their environment. I'll say it again. Our genes, which code for and produce the proteins in our body, which are most everything, are modified by the environment in which they exist. This is huge. This puts us in the driver's seat because we have control over the environment that we create within our bodies. This is really exciting stuff for somebody who does holistic wellness, right? Really exciting. So again, what I stated a moment ago, you have the ability to modify gene expression based on the internal bioterrain you support within your body. So if we wake up in the morning and we choose a blueberry smoothie with some kale in it, and I have a recipe for you that'll be up there before long. We choose that as our breakfast instead of doing a drive-through where we could get some hash browns and a breakfast sandwich, for instance. I've had a time in my life where that was a choice that I made, so I can relate. If we make choice A and we consume those blueberries and that kale, we're loading our body with antioxidants, right? Those are two of the highest antioxidant things you can eat. And when we do that, that's working immediately in your body, like medicine. Like medicine. Blueberries have a property called anti-angiogenesis. Some of the most targeted cancer drugs that are out today, some of the drugs with very strong patents on them, work in the exact same fashion. They block blood perfusion or delivery to cells very selectively. Well, blueberries happen to do that also. So that blueberry smoothie, when you consume that, just understand that this is powerful on the level of a medicine, okay? I'm not advocating that if anybody you know or loves is on a cancer drug, they should stop that and just eat blueberries. But what I'm telling you is, from a preventative standpoint, you just can't go wrong consuming something with that much power for your health. Okay. So much of our nutritional data, which has been delivered to the American people for the last 30 years, was based on faulty science. Boy, that's a big statement, and we'll substantiate it right now. I feel a little sorry for this gentleman. He passed in 2004, I believe. He's a very, very brilliant man, okay? His name is Ancel Keys, and he's on the cover of Time magazine here. This is the January 13th, 1961 edition. And Ancel Keys, again, a brilliant individual, taught at Harvard, held multiple positions in different colleges. He drafted the lipid hypothesis, okay? He wasn't the first one to postulate the concept that cholesterol and fats caused arteries to have degenerative conditions set up within them, but he definitely drove it home, and he presented it in such a fashion that then our government latched onto it and changed our food guidelines to reflect that. So let's talk a little bit about what went wrong with this, again, brilliant individual. He believed very strongly in what he was doing, okay? So much so that he bypassed some of what the scientific process normally upholds, which is the hypothesis is placed out there, the testing is done against the hypothesis, and then if it's disproven, that's embraced by the scientists just as much as if it was, in fact, fulfilled. Well, in his case, he was just so bright, and he was, and so sure that he was correct, that he decided to leave out some data. He only selected the data that fit his original hypothesis. Ooh, this is ugly science out of a very, very, very bright man, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but that was in 1961. So here's another Time magazine cover, and this is Time magazine in 1984, and the news is not getting any better, right? Cholesterol, and now the bad news. Well, here's the interesting thing, and I kind of jumped for joy when this arrived at my practice, this next one. Here's the Time magazine cover for June 23rd. So I'm about 4 days early, but we know how the magazines work. Eat butter. Scientists labeled fat as the enemy. Why? They were wrong. So we don't have to look back very far to see that not only were the scientists wrong, but the same magazine that's now delivering this news, and this is correct. This fits with what I'm talking about today. But they were the same folks that put Ancel Keys on the front cover for introducing the lipid hypothesis and embracing it very strongly for the next 30 years. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Ancel Keys, he's a physiologist, is a scientist at the University of Minnesota, born in Colorado Springs, and again, identified at a very young age as exceedingly bright, gifted, in fact. Very interesting individual, went through an interesting life as a young man, tried a lot of different things. He actually had a degree in zoology, was very knowledgeable about biology in general. Went back to school and became a physiologist, and then taught at Harvard. He fathered the concept of the lipid hypothesis as we know it after conducting something known as the 7 countries study. This began in 1958 and it finished up in the 60s, hence the 1961 Time magazine front cover. Well, really, he studied 22 countries. He studied 22 different countries, and what he did was he studied the quantity of fat and cholesterol that they consumed in their diet, and then their incidence of heart disease. What he found was it was all over the map. There were certain countries that consumed high quantities of fat that had very low levels of heart disease. And there were certain countries that consumed very low quantities of fat that also had high degrees of heart disease. This kind of blew a hole in his theory. His theory was that the lipids, the fats, and the cholesterol were producing the heart disease. So he shaved it down. Again, he thought he was doing the right thing, but he shaved down the results, cut away the results that didn't fit his hypotheses, and left us with 7 different countries, of which the United States, Canada, and Italy are 3 of those 7. Finland is another one. Norway is another. No, I'm sorry, Norway was excluded. They have a very high-fat diet and low heart disease. That one was kicked out. At the end of the day, he presented this 7 countries study and said that by consuming these lipids, these fats in our diet, and cholesterol from our diet, we set ourselves up for heart disease. Well, folks listened. At the level of the government, the United States government listened. And the Department of Agriculture followed suit. And some of the changes that were brought about here were recommendations to move away from animal fats. Lard, for instance. Animal fats in the form of higher fat cuts of meat were cut out of the diet. What was brought in their place were vegetable oils, okay? Vegetable oils. Margarines were brought in place of butter, okay? And the concept here was that the saturated fat was the problem. In fact, he coined the term artery clogging saturated fat. We now know that artery clogging and saturated fat don't go together. Artery clogging and inflammation, those go together. Let's take a step forward and see the aftermath. So here's 1984, the cover I showed you before. Here's some verbiage directly out of that extensive article. Cholesterol is proved deadly, and our diet may never be the same. Our diet hasn't been the same. They were right about half of that. The first part, they were mistaken about. I'll tell you right now as I stand before you, and I do extensive training in nutrition. Most recently, I was out in Montana and took in a lecture from a worldwide renowned cardiologist, and he stood before us and shared that half of the individuals who suffer with cardiovascular accidents, CVAs, have normal cholesterol levels. He also stated that roughly 50% of the population that experience heart attacks have normal cholesterol levels. So we've got normal cholesterol levels in folks experiencing heart attacks, and we've got high cholesterol levels in folks who never do experience a heart attack. It's not as perfect a relationship as was originally stated. And for decades, this is the next line that's actually in this article, all the way back in 1984. It says, for decades, researchers have been trying to prove conclusively that cholesterol is a major villain. They're working really hard to prove it. It's not jumping right out as the fact. So for decades, researchers have been trying to prove conclusively that cholesterol is the major villain in this epidemic, which is heart disease. It's not been easy. I get a picture of a square peg and a round hole there. But a lot of dedication on the part of folks who want to see this move forward, okay? Let's move forward and talk a little bit more. So now the reckoning. The data is now conclusive that we can't make the direct connection between cholesterol level and heart disease, for instance, blood lipid levels and heart disease. And what we've seen since the American population has changed their diet is a move in the opposite direction, okay? Heart disease and inflammatory burden diseases, obesity in particular, has skyrocketed since changing to the dietary recommendations that would be directly in alignment with what Dr. Ansel Keys recommended and we embraced on the governmental level. So the recognition that saturated fat is a stable entity. When you hear saturated, think of that S just meaning stable, because from a chemical standpoint, that's exactly what it is. Saturated fat is stable. The admittance that misinformation and poor adherence to basic scientific principles left us in a population that has a pro-inflammatory status in general, okay? Here's the food pyramid as it was presented in 1991. Let's just talk about a few of the flaws in this pyramid. At the bottom, we have carbohydrates, breads, cereals, rice, and pastas. Now, carbohydrates are absolutely essential for our bodies, okay? There's the quote-unquote diet wars out there between the low-carb folks or no-carb folks versus the complex carb folks who want to be low-fat. The fact of the matter is we need carbohydrates. We need them for our body to function. The interesting thing, though, is we can get more than what we need from consuming vegetables, for instance. Okay, carrot's a great example. Bound up within all the fiber and wonderful phytonutrients in a carrot are the carbs that make that a quick energy source for our body. Apple's another perfect example. The reason we have apples and almonds as a snack today is that's a very balanced way of eating. Again, carbohydrates are present, but in a way your body can manage quite readily. So this food pyramid indicating that 6 to 11 servings a day of breads, cereals, rice, and pastas, that alone will put us in a pro-inflammatory state. And I'll talk to you a little bit about it, but I'll give you a hint, and it has to do with the oil profiles that are in grains, okay? We hear a lot about omega-3 oils being good for our bodies. In fact, it's good to eat, for instance, fresh-caught salmon because it's very rich in omega-3s. Well, we can look at the ratio between omega-3 and omega-6s, okay? That ratio tells us a lot as to whether or not a food's going to be pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. And the balance that we would love to see would be a 2-to-1 ratio. If we had omega-6s at 2 parts omega-6 to every 1 part omega-3, we would be in great shape. And let me tell you, the inflammatory-based diseases I pointed to earlier up there wouldn't exist as they do now. Wheat, for instance, exists more at a level of 20 parts omega-6 to 1 part omega-3. Now, that's an extreme example. Can we pop some fish oil and mediate that? Yes, to an extent, provided we're not consuming those grains at a level of daily or 2 meals a day or 3 meals a day. And this isn't hard to imagine. There was a time in my life where I believed I was being very healthy, and I was consuming wheat 3 times a day, 7 days a week, okay? Now I understand what was wrong about that. So I jumped back to the food pyramid in 91. This bottom platform is the main problem. This is pro-inflammatory to consume these entities at that level, and it has to do with the biochemistry of what I shared with you about the oil profiles and also how your body reacts when you consume these. They go to energy very quickly, right? That's why we can get a rush from consuming carbohydrates. It's a blood sugar enriching process, but it happens very quickly, and then it can drop away, okay? And the resulting energy slump after that is an inflammatory inducing experience for the body. Vegetables weren't emphasized enough here, and another huge problem was up at the top of the pyramid were fats, oils, and sweets. Wait a second. Fats and sweets, those are 2 completely separate entities. I mean, I've enjoyed a donut before. I'm not going to stand up here as Mr. Holistic Wellness and tell you I haven't enjoyed a donut. So I understand where fat and sweets can come together, but categorically they're totally different. So we were told to consume them sparingly. And that's tough because what you'll soon see are certain fats are very beneficial for our body, very beneficial, and have to be consumed in order for us to be healthy. They changed the food pyramid in 2005 to rectify some changes, to rectify some of the problems. And I am happy to see the change there. It became a little more difficult to understand, a little more obscured, right? Because now we see all these categories, and it seems like they're given weight or importance based on the width of the band that populates that given part of the pyramid. Well, that's true. This is basically saying we know the old one was wrong, and this is the best solution we can come up with for now. Okay? We've still got a presence there in the way of grains that's much more than we really need, and fats, which are represented over here, are not given enough weight. We'll move forward now, and I want to just look at this quickly to wrap up the concept. This is again from the Center for Disease Control, and this is a map of obesity prevalence in the United States of America. The blue shaded areas, the lighter blues, indicate less than 10% of the population. And then the darker blue indicates the 10 to 14% of the population in that state. So we can see in 1991 we had obesity prevalent between 10 and 14%, roughly, right? The white areas, there's no data for those. By 1996, 5 years later, we became more entrenched with 15 to 19%. Big change in 5 years. Big change in 5 years. By 2003, we had a shift up to the 20 to 24 percentile, with certain areas of the country being at 25 and even up to 30. And in 2010, obesity had reached a level where we had many, many areas at over 30%. Massive, massive shifts if we look back to 1991. There's been a change. The most recent dietary guidelines now include My Plate. The pyramid, you can still find it on the CDC, but this My Plate is now the concept. We're seeing protein come in much more strongly. Vegetables are being emphasized. This is fantastic. Fruits also emphasized. And when we think fruits, we want to think low glycemic fruits. This means things that won't spike the blood sugar. Berries categorically tend to fit in this group, okay? The other example would be like a banana, which is absolutely wonderful to eat, great source of potassium and great energy, but that is a higher glycemic food. That spikes the blood sugar a bit more. So just know to balance it, and if you're going to be eating your berries with a little bit of banana, absolutely wonderful way to do it. And then dairy, they're recommending in a smaller serving also. The shape of things to come, this cracked me up. The evolution. If we look at that obesity trend that we saw earlier on the CDC image that I had up there, I can tell you that a big driver of that obesity trend is in fact products that are heavily sweetened, okay? And this can be with either sugar or corn syrup, but there is a way that corn syrup is metabolized in the body that differs slightly, okay? And the other factor is when you're consuming it in a fluid source, we can consume a lot of sugar very quickly. And it's nothing for me to do a couple intakes with patients throughout the week, and I'll sit down and say, what are you consuming in the way of soft drinks? And they'll say, oh, a cup or two a day, and they're talking about the 64-ouncer. They're not talking about 8 ounces, which is what a cup truly is. So this graphic speaks volumes. Anti-inflammatory eating. This is the solution. So let's talk about this. Low grain consumption, focusing on sprouted grains, okay? Something happens enzymatically whenever you sprout grains, and those enzymes begin a breakdown or digestion process of that grain. So there's bread that can be purchased mostly at health food stores, but this bread is actually made from grains that are first sprouted. And what you find is it's a lower glycemic load, meaning if we would eat one slice of that bread and take our blood sugar 10 minutes later, we'd come up with a given number. If we did that same experiment with a piece of white bread or even whole wheat bread that wasn't sprouted, that number would be far greater, far greater. In fact, I run a certain test in my office which allows us to gauge someone's insulin response. And there's two options. You can either chug 8 ounces of orange juice or you can eat a slice of white bread, because both of those things will spike the blood sugar to the same extent. Absolutely amazing. So here's what we can do. We don't have to give up the bread entirely. Toast with organic eggs in the morning, absolutely fine. Go with a sprouted wheat and make it 1 piece of toast. That's hard for me. If I'm going to have 1, I want 2. So organic pasture-raised meats as a steady protein source. We talked earlier about omega-3 acids as they relate to omega-6s. When an animal is pasture-raised, when it's allowed to walk around and eat grass, it accumulates, bioaccumulates the chlorophyll, the green compound within the grass it eats. And that is what imparts a favorable oil profile for that animal. Works exactly the same way for the salmon. The reason salmon is so beneficial for us is it's eating aquatic vegetation, which imparts that same benefit. So when a cow walks around and eats grass, and we then eat that meat, we're getting omega-3 oils, just the same type of oil that we get out of eating fresh salmon. So choose wisely, and that's the reason why it's worth it to pay a little bit more to eat pasture-raised meat, for instance. Now, salmon has a greater percentage per unit volume of omega-3, but a good grass-fed hamburger or grass-fed steak is a very healthy thing to be eating. Substantial quantities of fresh vegetables, preferably organic. I really underline the organic concept. Persistent pesticide residues on our food are not in our best interest, to put it simply. And low glycemic fruit as a source of phytonutrients, this is great because this is medicine for our bodies. Here's the essential nutrients. We've got water, which is the solvent that our body runs on. We're over 70% water. Amino acids, there's 9 of them that are essential. Fatty acids, 2 of them that are essential. 13 vitamins, 13 minerals, and over 10,000 phytochemicals, right? So looking at this phytochemical concept has been largely overlooked in the past. If we look back retrospectively over that past 30 years, it's only very recently that we've been appreciative of these phytonutrients. These are found abundantly in green leafy vegetables like kale, like Swiss chard, like spinach, blueberries, raspberries. Just fantastic sources of these phytochemicals. Kale, I had to put it up here. It's one of the best. We measure something's health-giving properties as it relates to antioxidant activity by something called an ORAC scale. That's O-R-A-C, and that stands for oxygen radical absorbance capacity. So it basically just means these oxygen radicals in our body are the free radicals that are damaging. When we eat something that can absorb those and neutralize them, that is what imparts the benefit to our long-term health. On one level, it's one factor of how we fight cancer by eating these things. One of the factors. Kale has one of the highest oxygen radical absorbent capacity scores that you can get in any vegetable. Okay? All hail to kale. It also has 10 times more vitamin C than spinach, more calcium than milk, and more iron than beef. Pretty incredible stuff. So we think of macronutrients. This is proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. I talked about organic pasture-raised proteins. That applies for beef, for instance, or bison. Chicken, you would want to look for organic because it means the feed that it's been consuming doesn't have pesticide residues or other compounds being put in it. And in the dairy department, this is especially important. You can get butter that's organic. That means these cows have been eating food that doesn't have pesticides in it. It also means that they haven't been given hormones. In order to increase milk production, cattle are often given hormones. Recombinant bovine growth hormone is one of them. And this actually causes production of the milk, and so it's financially in the best interest of the dairy. In this case, though, by going organic, you avoid that. And you can get grass-fed organic milk and organic milk products very easily also. Carbohydrates are constituents of vegetables and legumes, beans, so minimal grain intake. We just don't need that much. And then the micronutrients. These are the phytochemical compounds found in the fruits and vegetables, and these are some of the subcategories. And again, if we went back 30 years, we didn't even know of these. About 14, 15 years ago is where we really researchers became aware. And then they taught the rest of us after that. So this is cutting edge if we think of our lives and how we can apply this. This is incredibly powerful information. These polyphenols, terpenes, sulfur compounds, saponins, these are all within these fresh vegetables, fresh fruits, and a great way to boost our health status. I'm going to leave you with this concept. Micronutrient loading is one of the best ways to ensure that you're getting many of the compounds I've spoken so highly of today. So this is what I want you to think of as big vegetable intake via blending or juicing once per day. So there's some very strong blenders out on the market now. They have high horsepower setting motors, and you can throw that kale in there along with some almond milk, water, low glycemic beverages, and blast it and turn it into a drink and down that. High micronutrient loading in one dose like that in the form of a smoothie in the morning. I mentioned the blueberries and kale. This is a great way to get your daily dose of those micronutrients and know that you're fighting the inflammatory disease processes that we've outlined here. Here's the berry super smoothie. 2 cups of kale or spinach, 3/4 cups of frozen mixed berries, 1/4 cup of either raw nuts. So I love walnuts because they're high in omega-3 oils that we talked about earlier. Almonds are wonderful for us also, very balanced protein, fat, carbohydrate ratio. And then 1 to 2 cups of water or almond milk. And they make unsweetened almond milk. So I'll leave you with that berry super smoothie and that concept. And then also make sure you're consuming adequate water. And the water, we want to hydrate to about half of our body weight stated in pounds. So 180 pounds is what I weigh. 90 ounces of water is what I should be drinking every day. Okay, half of my body weight restated in ounces. Thank you all so much for your attention and for attending today.